There are nights that divide history into before and after. April 7th, 2026, is precisely such a date. While the usual April snow sweeps outside, Vladimir will have to choose the path that all of humanity will follow. It sounds like an apocalyptic scenario. Perhaps, but this revelation didn't come to us from Hollywood or the files of the secret services. Its source is the living faith and foresight of a man who paid with his blood for every word he saw about our future. It was spoken in the late 1990s by a man who, even in his lifetime, was called a living saint. Schema Commandrite Zasima, a Donetsk elder and spiritual father, to whom people flocked from all over the former Soviet Union for advice. In 2002, just a few months before his death, he left a prediction that still chills the blood of those who understand the scale of events. This prophecy was long preserved in the sermon records of the Dormition St. Nicholas Vasiliv Monastery. This is a small monastery near Volnovakha, lost among the steppe hills of Donbass. A place few knew about until words were spoken there, addressed to a man named Vladimir. Words of a fateful choice and a night when absolutely everything will be decided. Which path leads to light, and which to darkness? What will happen to the planet if the choice is wrong? The elder spoke of this, encoding his thoughts in images and metaphors understandable only to those familiar with the context of Orthodox prophecy. But before we attempt to decipher this code, we must answer the question of why we should believe his words at all. The fact is, true prophecies don't fall from the sky. They are born of extreme experience, of suffering, and that special clarity of vision that comes only to those who have been through fire. And Zasima had been through a hell that would have broken any ordinary person: exile, persecution, prison beatings. Years when the very word God was forbidden, and a person could be sent to prison for having an icon in their home. He didn't just survive, he maintained his faith and acquired the gift of clairvoyance, the ability to read people's destinies like an open book and peer beyond the veil of time. Today, many of his predictions have already come true. These are not legends, they are facts, documented by eyewitnesses. But the prophecy about Vladimir and the night of April 7th stands apart. It concerns each of us. Watch this video to the end, and you will understand why this date is so close. The path to holiness is never easy. The story of the man who left behind the prophecy about Vladimir began where you least expect to find the source of spiritual achievement, a prison hospital. Sverdlovsk region, September 3, 1944. Within cold walls, saturated with fear and suffering, the first cry of a baby was heard. His mother lay on an iron cot, exhausted from childbirth and constant hunger. She was an exile. Her crime was refusing to renounce her Orthodox faith at the height of Stalin's repressions. The boy was named Ivan. No one could have imagined then that this child, born in prison, would become one of Russia's most revered elders. But that was still a long way off. After his mother's release, the family settled in Avdiivka, a small mining town near Donetsk. Dusty streets, spoil heaps on the horizon, hard labor. It seemed like a typical Soviet reality, but it was here that the secret that shaped the future prophet lay. A secret community of nuns operated in Avdiivka. These were women expelled from the closed St. John's Monastery. They did not go home, nor did they renounce their vows. They continued to live together, secretly maintaining their monastic life right under the noses of the Soviet authorities. Among them was Matushka Antonina, Ivana's mother's sister. Imagine this scene. Outside, Soviet slogans, party meetings, and atheistic lectures. Inside, behind tightly closed shutters, icons in the red corner, the flickering of oil lamps, and ancient prayers murmured in hushed tones. Little Ivan grew up between these two realities. By day, an ordinary Soviet boy. By night, a witness to secret religious services and a listener to stories of martyrs who went to their deaths rather than betray Christ. It was a school of spiritual fortitude not found in any textbook. The years passed, Ivan grew up, Stalin died, but the persecution of the church under Khrushchev became even more sophisticated. The young man had already made his first choice between light and darkness. He chose the path of faith, and retribution followed immediately. School in Avdiivka in the 1950s became his first place of torture. His classmates quickly realized that Vonya Soka was different. He didn't wear the Arcturus star. He didn't wear a red tie and ignored the Komsomol. In a country where every step was dictated by the party, this was a challenge. They called him priest, as they called him, with contempt and that special childish cruelty that knows no bounds. But the bullying by his peers was just the tip of the iceberg. The teachers, those who were supposed to protect the child, themselves set the class on the boy. Beat up that priest, let him learn how to run to church. These words were heard right in the classroom. And after school, in the gateways, they beat him with fists and sticks, in a mob against one. Can you imagine what it's like to go every morning to a place where you're hated, and know that all this can end with a single word? Take off your cross, join the young pioneers, say there's no God, and it will all be over. They'll accept you, they'll stop beating you. Many adults have broken under such pressure, but 10-year-old Vanya Soka didn't. Each time, wiping the blood from his broken face, he rose. Persecuted, hated, I go to God's temple to spite the demon. He repeated these words like a shield. Much later, he would say, all my life I've had one party, mother, the church, one charter, the gospel. It was then, in the dusty corridors of the Avdiivka school, that the spiritual core was forged that would later allow him to see the invisible. When Ivan turned 17, in 1961, Khrushchev's persecutions reached their peak. Churches were closed by the hundreds, monasteries were sealed. Ivan applied to the seminary, but the answer was curt. The documents were rejected. No explanation. Give up. This word was not in his vocabulary. If it can't be done officially, then it will be unofficial. He enrolled in technical school and studied to be a veterinarian. A strange choice for a future elder, but it was the perfect camouflage. Avoid attracting the attention of the authorities, earn a living, and bide his time. Exactly 1 year after graduating from technical school, Ivan simply disappeared. Neighbors and colleagues were perplexed, but he was already at the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, a secret novice in the most ancient monastery in Rus. The Lavra then lived by its own laws, which predated any Soviet regime. It was there, in the caves, that Ivan first felt the presence of eternity. But the respite was short-lived. The Lavra was closed, the monks dispersed. His path led him to the Pochi of Lavra, where he met two great men, Saint Kuksha of Odessa and Saint Amphilochius of Pochiev. These were pillars of faith who had survived the camps. Ivan absorbed their experience like a sponge. And it was then, in Elder Kuksha's cell, that a vision of the future first unfolded before his inner eye. The first vision, the first touch of a gift that would fully blossom decades later. Only in 1975 did Ivan finally achieve his goal and enter the Leningrad Theological Academy. Years of persistence bore fruit. There, he took monastic vows with the name Sovety. After graduating from the academy, he was sent to Odessa, to the very monastery where his mentor, Kuksha, had previously served. And here, something incredible happened. Father Sovety was given the cell of Saint Kuksha, the room where he had once sat at the elder's feet. He was even given the saint's schema monastic vestments. This was not just an inheritance, but a spiritual baton. From that moment on, his prayers changed, deeper, more powerful, as if a point-taken channel had opened between heaven and earth. His fraternal circle noticed, and in his novels, Sovety could pray for entire nights. And then, clear visions began. One of the first shook him. He saw Kiev, the cradle of orthodoxy. But a thick darkness swirled over the city, a black spiritual hole devouring the light. The domes were drowning in this gloom. He didn't yet understand when this would happen, but he knew for sure, this was the real future. And the most terrible prophecy about the night of April 7th and the choice of a man named Vladimir was already waiting in the wings. The vision of a black hole over Kiev haunted him day and night. But life gave him no time to reflect. It was preparing a new, even more dramatic turn. It was the late 1970s. Grim news arrived from his native Avdiivka. Ivan's mother, the very woman who had given birth to him in prison and carried the faith through all her exile, had fallen gravely ill. She was fading, and there was no one nearby to care for her. Father Sovety faced a heartbreaking choice: remain in the blessed monastery, in the cell of his teacher Kuksha, pursuing a spiritual career, or abandon everything for the sake of filial duty. For him, there was no choice. He submitted a request for a transfer to the Donetsk diocese. The church authorities were perplexed by the idea of leaving Odessa, a sacred place, for some remote village, but he insisted. He was appointed rector of the church of St. Alexander Nevsky in the village of Alexandrovka. It was a true backwater of the Donbass, a place almost unheard of. The church greeted him in ruins. The roof had collapsed, the iconostasis was eaten away by damp, the walls were cracked. From the outside, it looked like humiliating exile, but Father Sovety saw it as a calling. From the first day, he set to work himself, hauling bricks, mixing mortar, patching the roof. A monk with a higher academic education, he worked as a simple mason, and in the evenings, he served. Long, full monastic services, without abbreviations, without rushing. At first, 5 people stood in the empty church, sometimes 3, But time flowed differently during his services. People began to remark, "You leave the church and feel like you're born again." Word of an unusual priest who could see right through everyone spread throughout Donetsk, Mariupol, and then throughout Ukraine. Hundreds flocked to him. Lines formed from dawn. Professors and workers, party bosses and beggars came. And he told each one exactly what they needed to hear. The fame of the insightful priest grew, but so did the attention of those in identical grey jackets. 1983 marked the beginning of his personal journey of the cross. The KGB could no longer ignore Father Savati's influence. He was arrested right after services. Two men in civilian clothes, a black Volga at the gate, a classic example of Soviet terror. Interrogations lasted for hours, but these were not just conversations. He was beaten. They beat him professionally, methodically, so as not to leave obvious marks on the outside but to destroy everything inside. The blows were light. This is why he would suffer from severe shortness of breath for the rest of his life. Then they moved to his back, blow after blow, until he lost consciousness. When he came to, the interrogation began again. They demanded of him a recantation, the names of those who came to him, lists of the unreliable. He remained silent and prayed. They released him, only to arrest him again a month later. This cycle repeated itself for 3 years, from 1983 to 1985. His body couldn't take it. It was then, due to the deformation of his spine from the beatings, that a hump began to grow. Wounds opened on his legs that wouldn't heal for years. They bled and festered, causing unbearable pain with every step. But something strange was happening. In moments of the most terrible pain, when consciousness was almost fading, images unfolded before his mind's eye. He saw not the past, but the future. He saw a war, not the one that ended in 1945, but a different one, a terrible, fratricidal one. With tanks on the familiar streets of Donbass and planes in the skies above Kiev. Each blow from his tormentors seemed to burn images of the coming catastrophe into his memory. The authorities realized they couldn't break him. So they decided to change tactics. If they couldn't destroy his influence, they had to send him somewhere he wouldn't be heard. They found the perfect place for exile. A ruined church in a remote village on the very edge of the Donetsk region. Nikolskoye, the place that should have been his grave, but instead became the cradle of his greatest prophecies. When Father Savati arrived in Nikolskoye in 1987, even his hardened heart wavered. The church stood in the middle of the steppe, like a ghost. The windows were boarded up, the roof was rotten, but the worst was still to come. Right at the entrance to the church, the authorities had installed a public toilet, and a smoking garbage dump surrounded it. The courtyard was overgrown with weeds as tall as a man. Inside, instead of an iconostasis, there was a plywood board, and hundreds of rats scurried in the corners. They weren't afraid of people, they owned the place. Let him rot there with his rats, the KGB handlers laughed. But Father Savati, looking at this desolation, suddenly smiled. Those nearby thought he'd gone mad with grief, but he knew something they didn't. Even in his cell, in moments of semi-consciousness, it was revealed to him, Nikolskaya is holy ground. He began questioning the local elders and discovered that, according to legend, the Mother of God herself had appeared here before the revolution. Unexiled monks lived here, which preserved an ancient prophecy. The time would come, and a monk would restore the monastery on this site, and there would be 2 monasteries, one for men and one for women. Father Savati understood this was his destiny. In that same year, 1987, he took the great schema, the highest degree of monasticism, with the name Zasima. And so the miracle began. A crippled old man with a hunchback and unhealed wounds on his legs shoveled manure out of the church himself, exterminated rats, and patched the walls. His hands were covered in bloody calluses, his back was stiff, but the church came alive. And people found him again. People walked dozens of kilometers to this remote place, where there were no roads or buses, because they knew a man lived there who spoke with God. By the late 1990s, the Dormition Nikola Vasiliv monastery flourished. 2 monasteries were built, exactly as the ancient prophecy had foretold. But the brighter the monastery became, the darker the elders' sermons became. While the world celebrated the end of history and hoped for eternal peace, Zasima Soka wept in his cell. No matter how much I pray, I see nothing good, only a terrible black hole where Kiev used to be, he told his children. It seemed strange at the time. Ukraine was independent, churches were being built, the gold of their domes shone. But the elder saw the truth. He predicted a church schism with frightening accuracy. He named the date as 2018, 20 years before the event. He said that persecutors would come, that the unity of the church would be torn apart, and that Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople would become a tool in the hands of dark forces. From here this commotion will roll across the entire Russian land, he warned. The word Kolotnia, a simple folk word, became his designation for the coming chaos. He saw the glassy eyes of young people who would shoot their brothers for fun. He described the Maidan and the coup even when these words had no political meaning. But his most important prophecy concerned what would happen after the outbreak of the Great War. Shortly before his death in 2002, Elder Zasima began to speak of a man named Vladimir. This name, on his lips, sounded like a key to the future. He didn't name names, but those listening attentively understood the scale of the matter. He was speaking of a choice that would face the leader of a vast country. The elder said there would be 3 knots of fate. The first was Vladimir, the baptizer of Rus. The second was Vladimir, the one who led the country to atheism. And the third was Vladimir, the one on whose shoulders would fall the choice between light and darkness in humanity's very last hour. And it was here that the very date was revealed, the night of April 7, 2026. Why this particular date? The elder explained that by that time, the cup of lawlessness would overflow. By then, Kiev would be completely overwhelmed by spiritual darkness, and in Donbass and throughout Rus, the fires would blaze so fiercely that human strength would be exhausted. On that night, according to Zasima's vision, Vladimir would find himself in a situation where earthly advisors would be powerless. It would be a moment of absolute loneliness before God. On the one hand, there was the proposal of world order, a deal with NATO forces, which the elder called the seal of the Antichrist in a spiritual sense, a betrayal of faith for the sake of peace. On the other hand, there was the path of complete fidelity to the canonical church and the union of Slavic lands. Russia will endure if Vladimir chooses the light, the elder whispered, clutching the cross with his mutilated fingers. But the price of this choice would be enormous. On August 29, 2002, schemer Imandrite Zasima departed to the Lord. His body by that time was practically in ruins. The doctors who examined him in his final months could only shrug their shoulders. He had enough ailments for 10 people. A hunched back from blows in KGB cells, bruised lungs that barely allowed him to breathe, unhealed wounds on his legs that bled until his last hour. But something else was astonishing. The weaker his body became, the louder and clearer his voice sounded. He served until the very end. Even when he couldn't stand, they would support him under the arms and he would celebrate the liturgy. In his final days, he hurried. He felt time was running out, and he needed to convey the most important thing, what he saw there, beyond human comprehension. Hold on to Moscow, hold on to the Russian Orthodox Church. This was his spiritual testament. Simple words that today, in an era of sanctions and schisms, take on a steely meaning. For him, Moscow was not a political center, but a spiritual anchor. He knew the time would come when autocephaly and independence would be shouted from all sides. But he warned, as soon as you break with Moscow, you will fall into the wolf's jaws. Now let's return to that very date that today makes many hold their breath. The night of February 7, 2026. Why did the elder single it out? 7 in Orthodoxy. The number of completeness. 7 sacraments, 7 ecumenical councils, 7 seals. February is the month of transition, when winter still rages, but spring is already breathing down our necks. This is a time of maximum vulnerability for nature and humanity. The year 2026 is exactly 2 12-year cycles after his death. The elder seemed to have calculated the mathematical point at which the world's spiritual tension would reach its peak. In his secret notebooks, Zasima described this night as a moment of silence. He said that at this time, Vladimir, a man endowed with enormous power, would have to make a choice that would cost the lives of millions or, conversely, grant them salvation. The path of darkness. The elder saw it as a deal with the forerunners of the Antichrist. He warned that Vladimir would be offered global security and entry into the common family of nations at the price of betraying spiritual foundations. If this path were chosen, Zasima foresaw dire consequences. Madness will overwhelm the cities, churches will be converted into museums or clubs, and in place of Rus will remain only a scorched field. This is the path of pride, where man decides he is wiser than God and can negotiate with the devil. The path of light. The elder described this path as one of humility, not weakness. It is the courage to recognize that true strength lies in the unity of the Slavic spirit. Zasima saw that if the choice was made in favor of light, a miracle would occur. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus would once again become a single organism. Not through conquest, but through spiritual insight. The black hole over Kiev, about which he had wept for years, would begin to heal. Faith will return to the mother of Russian cities, and the schismatics will scatter of their own accord, like shadows from the sunlight. But herein lies the deepest secret of the prophecy. Those who keep the elders' notes point to an important detail. Vladimir is not only the name of a specific leader. Listen to the meaning of this name, he who rules the world. Zasima Soka often hinted in his talks that each of us is the Vladimir of our own soul. Each person controls their own inner world. And on the night of February 7, 2026, not only the ruler but the entire nation will face a spiritual test. The elder taught astonishing things. The prayer of an ordinary person can change the Tsar's decision. He said that God expects at least one prayerful person from every family. And if on that fateful night, millions of people throughout Rus do not sleep but turn to God with sincere repentance, this will create a spiritual shield that will help the leader make the right decision. You understand, Vladimir's choice is our collective choice. It is the sum of all our forgiveness, all our prayers, and all our faithfulness. The elder saw this connection. As the people pray, so will their ruler be. The monastery near Volnovakha, which the elder built with his own hands, today lies in the very heart of the fire. This is terrible proof that his visions were not a figment of his imagination. He saw shells flying at the domes of his monastery back in the days when cows grazed there. But he was never a prophet of despair. Russia will endure. He spoke these words with such force that it took his listeners' breath away. He saw Russia as the last ark in a raging ocean of madness. He predicted that when the world finally loses its human form, it is here that great grace will remain. The forces of hell and the Antichrist will not overcome the Russian Church if it remains true to its roots. What should we do today, when only a few months remain until February 7, 2026? Zasima Soka left behind simple advice. Pray briefly, but with soul. Do not despair, hold on to the truth. He did not call for political action. He called for personal spiritual diet. Don't let hatred enter your heart, don't dehumanize your enemy, remember that God's judgment is upon all authority. Schema Archimandrite Zasima Soka lived a life full of pain, but died in the light. A boy from prison, a youth with a broken face, an old man with a hump on his back. He proved that darkness cannot devour one who has become light. The prophecy of the night of February 7th is not a horror story. It is the last warning and, at the same time, a great chance. A chance for each of us to wake up. What do you think will happen that night? Do you believe that the fate of the world can be decided in the silence of one February night, or is it all just a metaphor for our inner choice? Remember the promise the elder, the darkest hour is just before dawn. And on the night of your choice, may your heart show you the way to the light. Glory to God for everything. See you in new issues.